Hey, so here's a question. Was King Arthur real? If so, where did he live? When did he live? Who did he rule? Now, supposing he was indeed a real king, how would you describe his kingdom? Like in very simple terms, the aesthetics of his rule. Was it guys in plate armor and towers and castles, or was it tartans and blue paint and wooden hill forts? What comes to mind? Can you point out Camelot on a map? Welcome to the fourth part in a series on how games in the historical strategy genre go about doing their history. I figure around the halfway point is a good time to mention the broader series and then do a tally of what we had so far. There's been historiography with Civ 5 and Civ 6, Great Men Theory in EU4, social history with humankind, and now this, with more coming. Modern historians tend toward understanding Arthur as more myth than man, but that doesn't make him entirely fictional. It also, quite surprisingly, is not the true subject of this video. I want to explore the idea of how myths and, consequently, popular perceptions damage understandings of history. Crusader Kings 3 is a game by Paradox Interactive, seeking to simulate the rule, rise, and fall of medieval dynasties. You play as a member of a dynasty, or more accurately as generations within a dynasty, sometimes sons, but always dynastic relatives, depending on inheritance laws. The goals are largely self-constructed. It's a sandbox of feudal politics, essentially. The game takes place from either 867 or 1066 to 1453 across much of the Old World continental mass, with specific focus given to what else but the Crusades and their participants. The game has a few quirks that demonstrate how popular perceptions influence tellings of history. Gameplay in Crusader Kings 3 is primarily focused on interpersonal dynamics through time and how those affect statecraft. In some ways, this means its historical lens is inevitably more focused on quote-unquote great men, as described in the EU4 video, than it is on social movements as described in the humankind video. But it comes with a bit of a twist that puts it kind of between the two. Much of the gameplay is about avoiding the consequences of events, trying not to die of the plague, maneuvering the law to stop inheritance rules from fracturing an empire, resisting peasant revolts and crown usurpations. In this way, the game is handing us a framework rare for the genre. Death and revolutions are fail states, or can spiral into them. The death of a good king at a bad time is actually significant. Recovering from or future-proofing against losses is the game. Dynastic survival is the goal. Now, onto how this game connects with the King Arthur premise I've presented. How is King Arthur depicted in Crusader Kings? Well, he's not. Let's answer some of those earlier questions. King Arthur, or the man whom past historians most often attributed that title, was a Romano-British lord who ruled in what is now Wales. Let's step back a bit further now. Arthur is described as a contemporary of the rump states formed from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, not feudal knights and castles as we know them. Why, then, is his popular depiction one of gallant Christian knights clothed like crusaders in Gothic castles with parapets and banners and 4 grey towers and 4 grey walls? Well, there's a lot of points of deviation in his depiction, often contemporary to the times they depicted him styled in. To date, we do not have enough evidence to support that Arthur was, in fact, real. He, a mythological pre-Anglo-Saxon king of Wales, managed to make his way into the mythology of the English, who are arguably not indigenous to Britain. That's more of a fun fact than a deeply relevant detail, but I just thought I'd stress that his mythos is very pliable and hard to pin to one place and people, because that will come back up. CK3 has a tool within the game that shows off a meticulously constructed history of its world prior to the game's start. Clans can go as far back as their semi-mythological founders, all the Roman emperors since Augustus are displayed, the creation and dissolution of monarchical titles is catalogued. Arthur features nowhere in them. Camelot is not a kingdom or a land. This is, I would say, for the best. However, the game does fall into a similar trap that Arthurian myth does. Where myths of King Arthur have adopted certain anachronistic and idealized aesthetics, granted to them by later chronicles, CK3 has managed to smooth away some of the complex realities of the medieval era. Not in that it's just a game and has to keep some things a bit simple, but in that it has foregone certain rich details that its predecessor, CK2, had. CK3 posits a default culture of the era, quite unsurprisingly centered on the Christian world of West and Central Europe. I mean, that's where the Crusades came from, right? And it's where the kings were, right? So it's all within the scope of things. Yet, I am hesitant to call this an accomplishment or failure of scope. Eventually, the game will get more fleshed out with DLC, but it's still worth noting what default means here. While it's a bit unfair to compare a game in its relative infancy to its predecessor with half a decade or more of expansions and feature additions, I do feel like it has a few weird blind spots, and those blind spots more or less serve the myths and misrememberings of history. The cultures without niche expressions are then simplified to the Frankish default. We go from the complexity of Byzantine succession to a typical primogenitor feudal inheritance. And so, the succession laws, the cultural distinctions of a non-feudal Roman society is overwritten. The potential argument that it isn't the focus of the game is a bit lacking, given the map reaches as far as Siberia and Mongolia, places that have never had crusades or kings or three, which is a choice on the part of the designers. That's not to say that the game itself is deeply at fault. Modeling so many cultures and their nuances would be a massive undertaking. However, they've kinda already done the work before. As a small jab at Paradox, they kind of failed to pass the low bar the Civ series sets of carrying over at least half of the features from the previous complete edition of one entry to the next. Like, we have to buy Norse flavor packs again? Artifacts again? Why are republics unplayable like this is base CK2? So little of what makes up a complete CK2 is baseline in CK3. Like, we got a big map. Okay, cool, but come on. Anyway, not the point of the video, but it does affect the history they present. By the time of the medieval era, Arthur had been long gone. So far gone that none could really say where, and indeed if, he truly reigned. Again, where is Camelot? Some sources point here, but in reality, Camelot wasn't even part of the Arthurian mythos until the Vulgate cycle in the early 13th century. Many depictions of and additions to the historiography of King Arthur arose during the era confined to Crusader Kings' gameplay. Figures like Geoffrey of Monmouth and Thomas Malory, as well as several French poets, added to the canon exhaustively, and somewhat confusingly, as details were altered between tellings. Monmouth in particular was once believed to be an actual historian, and not just some guy making up neat stories. I mean, he once said that Arthur's kingdom expanded beyond Britain, from Iceland to Norway to Gaul. In his telling, Arthur defeated the Romans to seize Gaul, which is a pretty blatant timeline discrepancy given the state of the empire. So this leads us to having a very muddled understanding of the basic history of the Isles for quite a long time. But that's not why Arthur is depicted as a medieval king. It was not uncommon in medieval art for biblical scenes or events of antiquity to be depicted in contemporary style. Look at these illuminated manuscripts about King David, like King of Israel, Judea around 1000 BCE, King David, David and Goliath David. There's metal armor and coats of arms and hauberks and halberds and horse armor. It's totally medieval. Mixing this idea of contemporary attire and style in depictions of the past with Geoffrey's already very loose and murky timeline, we can see how it all just becomes a bit of a soup. The end result is that Arthur and his round table look like crusaders with 14th century stone castles and weave between being magical and fantastical through Merlin and true Christian knights akin to Charlemagne's paladins. Anecdotally, I'd never even thought to question the aesthetic of King Arthur until a very cursed and incredibly non-functional game crossed my path and depicted him as contemporary to the Romans. The point of all this, though, is that the way we imagine or remember events is not always accurate to the times. Sometimes it's because we lack the knowledge to be precise or specific. Sometimes it's simpler to imagine something as adjacent to a time we are already familiar with. and sometimes nuance is simply difficult. Earlier I said that Arthur is contemporary of the Roman Empire more than knights, but in truth, the whole of the medieval courts were also contemporary of a Roman Empire. Inarguably one, but arguably two. And while that's not exactly esoteric knowledge, it certainly isn't the sort of thing that features in the popular perception of the Middle Ages. Like, Rome is over. When we speak of the era, we tend to focus on exclusively the feudal structures of kings and crusades and all of that, to the detriment of the history of the East. Byzantium is an obstacle. The Abbasids are an opponent. Countries and cultures beyond Western Europe only exist when they come in contact with the Western feudal kingdoms. In this sense, understanding the medieval era as exclusively feudal is just as removed from reality as understanding King Arthur as medieval. The Crusader Kings franchise started with and has only begun to shake off this lens. Muslims weren't originally playable, and Byzantines, via their Orthodox religion, lacked the mechanics and detail of Catholicism until patches and expansions. And to be fair, I'm not saying they should have stuck to Crusading Kings. And I imagine many people, would say that the game is only made better by broadening of its cultural range and diverse gameplay options. For an example of what it's like when we successfully combat a misconception, I offer the term Dark Ages. Maybe you've noticed that the term the Dark Ages has slipped away from common use. That's an example of a false perception that has narrowed, almost shriveled, I suppose. In fact, for our purposes, it's a kind of meta one, too. People sometimes claim that the fall of Rome caused a Dark Age, but Dark Age was not originally used to imply an age of decay and downfall. It was meant to convey that we simply knew too little about an era, had a gap in our history, an absence of sources. It was something we could eventually shed some light on. But outside of scholarly circles, it gained the alternative meaning of dark as in darkness, opposite a golden age, a space of gritty lawlessness and war and violence, brutality, that sort of thing. And that stuck for a while as the term, if nothing else because the lack of sources did point people to the idea of a lack of culture. They feed each other in that way. If you're not finding manuscripts, then you might conclude that none were made, that culture was arrested, halted. I've brought this up before, but part of the reason Renaissance doesn't work as a term for me on both a global scale and even in the European context is that it more or less implies some grand cultural shift that didn't quite happen. Sure, the hallmarks of what we now call the Renaissance exist, but the medieval era was not lacking for culture, just as the Renaissance was not lacking for war and brutality. I mean, one of the staple features of the Renaissance and its birthplace of northern Italy is the constant warfare between city-states. These wars were rife with duplicity and intrigue, enough so that you get things like the League of Cambrai, where half the participants switch sides across the near decade of wars. Ultimately, I'm not quite sure what to call this whole thing. This fantasy of what King Arthur was and should be, of essentializing the medieval era. The consequences of falling into myth and truism are adjacent to historical revisionism, but also something else entirely. It's not about carrying a false perception that came about from misinterpretation or absence of sources, it's about the absorption of false perceptions. I'm not saying I've made up something new, simply that an established name escapes me for the nuance there. Let me know if there is one that I've just obviously missed. On one level, this all reminds me of things as harmless as Renaissance festivals/fairs. Ren fairs are basically a hodgepodge that doesn't super care about nuance. Henry VIII isn't a medieval king, and lived in the time of gunpowder weapons, but that doesn't stop people from dressing in plate armor and blurring the eras. And the lines feel harder on barring the later Renaissance than on inviting the medieval. I feel like if you brought a prop flintlock pistol, you'd probably get side-eyed and people would say you look like a pirate. Accuracy is not the point, and that's fine. Not everything has to be perfect to reality. They can be fun. But the knock-on effect is that sometimes we associate things with entirely wrong eras, and that ripples out. Crusader Kings, on the other hand, just doesn't go far enough in its attempt at modeling a multifaceted world at times. And just like the Ren Fair, That's fine, because it's just a game and you shouldn't be using it as a proxy for learning actual history, but much like the Tales of King Arthur, it can be a gateway to wanting to know more, to know real history, and in that way, it's still important to eventually correct one's perceptions. Maybe next time you hear King Arthur, you'll think more of Romans and Celts than Christian knights and star-spangled wizard hats. Hey, speaking of Roman soldiers in Britain and all that, when chronologically did the Roman dominion stretch to Britain compared to, say, the birth of the Republic? When did it become an empire? It might surprise you to hear that sometimes the ways we talk about Rome are rather unhelpful in explaining when we mean. That the chronological distance from the dawn of Rome to the conquest of Britannia is more vast than the entirety of US history. Next time, we'll be looking at this very phenomena using Imperator Rome as a guide. Also, sorry for the delayed upload. The bonus video on social history is still coming. I was moving and I'm not a big enough channel yet to use the community features and tell people things without a whole video, so hopefully that wasn't confusing for anyone. Also, hopefully, some of you will be inspired to hit the subscribe button and I'll manage to grow a bit closer to using said wonderful feature. Final also, there's a whole half of a playlist set up so far using games to explore concepts like these. Maybe check that out and stick around for the next one. Okay. Bye.